Okay, we're going to start. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming on this rainy afternoon. I'm Isabella Tabarovsky from the Kennan Institute. I'll make a couple of announcements before we move on to our event. So this Friday, September 21st, we have a book launch with Dr. Victoria Smolkin, who was a fellow here. She will be presenting her recent book on A Sacred Space is Never Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism. It's at 10 a.m. on the 5th floor. Next Thursday, September 27th, in partnership with the Eurasia Foundation, we will be hosting the U.S. film premiere of Under One Sky, a collaborative documentary made by Russian and U.S. college students. It is 3:30 p.m. Now, our event today, For Your Freedom and Ours, remembering the Red Square protest of August 1968, we're really honored to have this distinguished panel with us. Sitting next to me is Pavel Litvinov, human rights activist, physicist, Soviet-era dissident, a Red Square protester, he was one of the participants in the 1968 Red Square demonstration against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. He was arrested to 5 years exile and sentenced to 5 years exile in Chita, Siberia. In 1974, after his return from exile, he and his wife Maya emigrated to the United States, and in New York, he joined fellow emigre dissident Valery Chalidze in publishing a chronicle of human rights in the USSR, which documented political repression. Really honored to have him here. Benjamin Nathans is Associate Professor of History, University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in modern Russia, Soviet Union, modern Jewish history, and the history of human rights. And he's currently working on a book entitled To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, A History of the Soviet Dissident Movement. And sitting next to him, Zhanna Nemtsova, a journalist with Deutsche Welle, where she anchors and produces her program Nemtsova Interview, which interviews leading European, Russian, and American politicians and intellectuals. She's the founder of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation, dedicated to her father, a member of the Russian opposition who was killed in 2015. She leads the Summer School of Journalism and Cultural Studies in Prague. Through the Boris Nemtsov Foundation, she received numerous prizes. She's widely published. Again, a pleasure to have everyone here. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Kennan Institute to stay up to date on our upcoming events. And with that, we'll start with Pavel, please.
Thank you, Isabella, for your kind invitation. Introduction, I meant. That's all right. Because the theme is as big as my life, I will try to make it a little bit shorter. But what I want to say is that our demonstration against Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia was not just a demonstration of some people who came together. It was basically development of ideas which were later became known as dissident movement in the Soviet Union. It's very important to understand that to put it in the right context, because the movement started as a movement in defense of freedom of speech, in defense of reading books, distributing books, discussing, doing what in normal country is a natural procedure, having newspapers, books, films, meetings, discussions, demonstrations, manifestations, support or disapproval of the government. All of that was completely absent in Stalin's Russia. It started to change under Khrushchev, and there was a mixed policy which was known as thaw. But after Khrushchev was ousted by Brezhnev and company from the government, they decided that people started to talk too much. To talk, meaning tell jokes in the kitchen, discuss different events not according to official procedure, and basically disregard the Soviet censorship. And the most important phenomenon was called samizdat, which is a well-known word now, but it's a kind of joke word which was mean myself publishing house, meaning izdat is publishing house abbreviation for any politizdat, political publishing house. Children is that Dissident, Children Published House, and so on. So samizdat was invented by a Russian poet, Glaskov. He published his poetry, which couldn't be published in official publication, in a small half of a page books, and on every page he wrote "Sam себя изdat." But then себя left, and samizdat became known. And as samizdat developed, and certain things were published in the Soviet Union and abroad, it became kind of hint to some kind of freedom of speech. And of course, the authorities didn't like it. They found two writers who published their books abroad, Andrei Sinyavsky and Yulia Daniel, and arrested them. They didn't publish it in samizdat. Actually, they sent them abroad through intermediaries, tourists, Western tourists, and journalists. But their books became known. KGB was looking for them for 10 years and found them, arrested. Sinyavsky was sentenced to 7 years of labor camp, Daniel to 5 years of labor camp. Eventually, Sinyavsky emigrated and died in Paris several years ago. Daniel died in Moscow. Defense of these two writers by Alexander Ginsburg was the next important step in developing dissident movement. Alexander Ginsburg started to collect documents about the case of Sinyavsky and Daniel. There was a stenogram, not really a stenogram, but a record of the process, which was done by wife of Sinyavsky and Daniel, and a so-called white book. And that white book, I also contribute to it a little bit, because I have a group of friends who knew English, French, Italian, and all European languages, and we translated from foreign languages into Russian to show international support of Sinyavsky and Daniel. So Alexander Ginsburg was arrested in his own turn. I, at the time, was assistant professor of physics in Moscow Institute of Fine Chemical Technology, and I decided, if Ginsburg is arrested, I will make a book about him. And I made eventually a book which became known as The Trial of the Four. Ginsburg and Glanskov were arrested, sentenced to 5 and 7 years of labor camp. There was a whole story with letters of protest, because the beginning of human rights was basically so-called подписантская кампания, signatures against violation of human rights. So signatories became подписанты. There were several hundred people, scientists, scholars, workers, all types of people who supported it. A lot of people, these people lost their jobs, lost a lot of things which people value in life, and important to remember that to lose a job in the Soviet Union is a very tough thing, because there is only one, in the Soviet Union, there was only one employer, and if that employer doesn't want you, you cannot find another employer, because it doesn't exist. That employer was the Soviet government, of course. KGB, who gave advice to this employer, was known whom that employer wants or doesn't want to do the job. So I lost a job as assistant professor, was expelled from graduate school in physics in Physics Institute of Academia Nauk, and then the pressure on me was stronger and stronger, but in the same time I was finishing and completing my work about case of Vladimir Bukovsky and case of Ginsburg and Glanskov. And at that time, we were very much aware that 1967-68 were special years, because there were a lot of development, a lot of protests around the world. And among them was appearance in Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, who promised to have a socialism with human face. I heard in the beginning of 1967 his speech, and I fell in love with the man. Fortunately, many years later, I met him, very before his death. This man really symbolized development of human rights, free speech. Of course, it was very small step into that, but Czechoslovakia became a new country, and we all thought that if Czechoslovakia will be able to maintain its momentum into development of freedom, then we have hope for Russia. Of course, we were not naive, we were not fools, but anybody can hope. And we thought that if Brezhnev will decide that Czechoslovakia didn't do anything bad for the Soviet Union and for international communism, then maybe they will let us do things. But at the same time, there were threats and threats against Czechoslovakia. And we met each other, friends, Soviet dissidents, and would say, if they will bring troops to occupy Czechoslovakia, we have to go to streets. It was my friend, Anatoly Ekapson, who didn't come to demonstration because he didn't know the time and date, because he was away. He was one of the first who told me, Pavel, if you are planning to organize a demonstration, don't forget about me. Another Drug, Petr Grigorovich Grigorenko, said that we will go to demonstration. And of course, if he was in Moscow, he would come and would be with us. But he was in Crimea. So there were a group of people from Leningrad who wanted to join. They were arrested 3 weeks before our demonstration. So what I'm saying is that it's not accidental 8 people came. And there were people whom we didn't know about in different places. People spoke up. We at least know now 20 or 30 names. So our demonstration attracted attention because of the historical development, because it was Moscow, because I, at the time, was in the intersection of publicity about the Soviet dissident movement, and the fact that I participated in it helped. But basically, it was not unique, and there were people in Poland and in Hungary and in Eastern Germany who also spoke up. We don't know some other people. So it was basically, reaction to Czechoslovakia was very simple. It's in my slogan, which I held together with Vladimir Delaunay, for your and our freedom. And it means we will be free if you will be free. If we'll let Czechoslovakia be free, then Russia will be free. It's an old slogan. I read about that slogan in letters of Gerson, our Russian writer and philosopher who lived most of his life abroad, and he met Polish dissidents, participants of Polish rebellion in Russia. I'm not going to go in that direction. And they had a toast: let's drink for your and our freedom, our and your freedom. So it was simple for us. Then I learned later that it was even before that Poles started use this symbol defending Belarusian peasants. So it was suddenly we got that present to get this slogan, and that was idea of freedom. And what is the idea of freedom? Freedom is human rights, freedom of speech, independent court system. Everything else will work out. So it was not geopolitics. It's not communism, anti-communism. All of them are very important, but in principle, it was a moral movement. It was part of the development of dissident movement, exactly as morality. I felt, and Larissa Bogaraz, who was basically inspiration for me, she was my friend, although she was 10 years older, but I admired her, and she had a personality where the distance between thought and act is zero. So when she decides to do it, she can write intuitively, very fast and very clearly and very, very logically. When she decides to do it, she doesn't care who else will do it. She will do it. So she and I were in the middle of the people who could have come to demonstration. And we met each other, and when August 21st, when the Soviet troops crossed Czechoslovakian border, we learned about that. Soviet newspaper, of course, lied that it was respond to imminent attack of West Germany and NATO. All that type of nonsense. Many people believed it, but for us it was clear that they want to strangle beginning of freedoms in Czechoslovakia. Larisa Bogaraz offered to meet at Red Square. It was a natural place because the Red Square is a place where you speak in support. Official Soviet demonstration, which started under Stalin, were in support of Soviet government, and that's where you can protest because we address the same government from the same Kremlin. And we chose a place, I don't remember exactly why, so-called Lobное место, which is a execution place where in Tsarist Russia, in several hundred years ago, they used to execute different criminals and rebels. So it was the place where we decided to come at 12 o'clock the next Sunday after invasion of Czechoslovakia by Soviet troops. So 25th of August was a natural day. And I met my friend Natasha Gorbanevskaya, and we went together with my wife Maya and with Natasha to Lara. And I said, I want that my slogan, which I liked very much, for our and your freedom. But I'm not going to sleep at home. I will stay with friends. So I don't have anything to write. She said, I would write it. I said, Natasha, you shouldn't go, because she had a son who was 5 months old. She had an older son who was 10 or something, but the younger son was very worried. It is my son too, but he didn't grow up with me. Anyway, she said, I will bring my son in a pram to demonstration. I said, but you won't carry the slogan. Please don't. She said, I will do something else. And she brought a Czechoslovak national flag with her. And she brought inside of the pram my slogan and several others. There was Kostya Babitsky, linguist, who brought a slogan in Czech language, which means long live free and independent Czechoslovakia. There was Volodya Drimlyuga, a worker whom we knew very little, who learned about demonstration, and he brought a slogan, freedom to Dubček, because Dubček was arrested, out with occupiers, and so on. We were sitting there, and as soon as we sat on the pavement on a little step in front of that Lobное место, people started to write toward us very fast. It was, some of them I recognized because I was at that time closely followed by KGB. It was my personal guards from KGB who were following me. There were some others who later spoke and were witnesses, so to speak, at our court. They all said later on that they didn't know each other, but they all worked in the same P.O. box address. Somehow they couldn't lie, and they had to say this P.O. box address was the same. We had a good time during the trial when we asked them how well they know each other, because the KGB and court asked how well we knew each other. And of course we knew each other, but the point was we were as persons, and they didn't know each other, but they came to beat us up. So they started, they broke our slogans immediately at took them away. Fortunately, that main slogan for your and our freedom was saved, and we have it. The copy of the slogan it became very popular. The way Natasha Gorbanevskaya wrote it, and immediately they started to beat us several times. Some KGB woman beat me over the head with a big shopping bag full of something which felt like bricks, but probably it was Karl Marx full edition. It's more likely it was books, but I was in such a high spirits that I even didn't know. It's only in an hour I started, when we were in police, I started to ask, why do I have such a headache, like somebody beat me over the head? And they said, you were beaten over the head. And I even didn't remember that. Next to me was sitting my remarkable friend, who is together with me, one of the three people who are still alive from participants of our demonstration, Vitya Feinberg. Vitya Feinberg was an art critic from Petersburg, very strong guy. Strong physically, strong psychologically, and when he believes in something, he does it. If I would try to compare his character with somebody, there would be two obvious characters of him. For his kindness and sympathy to people, although he was Jewish, but he had a lot of what is called Christian compassion, whatever these words mean. So what happened that I could compare him with Alyosha Karamazov, one of the Karamazov brothers' character, because Dostoevsky wrote that Alyosha Karamazov would come to a place and immediately somebody will give him a bed to sleep and dinner and so on, and he even won't notice because he would be so easy to like and so personable and kind. It's one half of Vitya Feinberg, my great friend. But there is another half of Vitya Feinberg which also belonged to him. It's a Miloš Forman main character in One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest. He spent 5 years in mental hospital. He was poisoned, not poisoned. He was drugged by some psychotropic drugs, and they tried to break his spirit. Fortunately, it didn't end as bad in the Miloš Forman film, but 5 years he suffered probably more than any of us. Meanwhile, I was sentenced to 5 years of exile in Siberia, worked as an electrician in mines, and basically it was much better condition because I wasn't behind barbed wire. My wife joined me there and with my son, and my daughter even was born there. So it was definitely things which don't happen in labor camp. Lara got 4 years of similar condition, Larissa Bagaraz, and Kostya Babitsky 3 years for that. Basically, they wanted to isolate me and Larissa Bagaraz most. But poet Vadim Delaunay and the worker Drimluga, they got the hardest in terms of labor camp. There were reasons for that because they were technically under previous trials, so they were violating payroll and automatically got. It's a technicality. They gave those terms which they wanted to give. So after 5 years of labor in Siberian exile, I came back to Moscow, and very soon it became clear that they will arrest me again. I was harassed and a couple of times picked up on the street, and eventually left the country and came to the United States, where I lived and taught and tried to help people in Russia and everywhere else to fight for human rights. Together with my friends Valery Chelidze and Ed Klein and Peter Redway. We started a magazine, Chronicle of Human Rights in the USSR, and published many books, and tried to smuggle them back into Russia. And basically was teaching physics in high school and living my life there. So all of us went our different way, and our demonstration was not forgotten, but practically didn't mention until somewhere in the mid of 2010, somewhere in 2005, suddenly would say legendary demonstration. We even didn't think about any of that. Suddenly everybody decided to mention it. So this year I was in Czechoslovakia. Already know Czechoslovakia, it's Czechia, Czech Republic, and next month I will be in Slovakia, where they want to speak about it. And I even came back to Moscow, which I visit regularly, but this time at the 50th anniversary of our demonstration on the 25th, I came to Red Square. There were about 100 of people who came. Some of them came with slogans for your and our freedom. And among them was my granddaughter, Nyusha, who is 22 years old. And I knew that she would come, but I didn't know what else she would do. And she came with a slogan, Svobodu Simtsova. Who is Simtsov? Simtsov is a Crimean, Ukrainian, but ethnically Russian playwright who was arrested and sentenced to 20 years after Crimea was occupied by the Soviet I'm sorry, it's not Soviet Union, it's Putin's Russia. And he is in prison, and he is holding a hunger strike for already 130 days. I have to remember, I'm trying to remember every day, and he needs help, and definitely my friend, Anatoly Marchenko, who also would have been in demonstration but was arrested before demonstration, and he was a husband of Larissa Bogaraz, and he died in labor camp as a result of very similar hunger strike. I believe everybody who can do something to save Sentsov, so his fate won't repeat the fate of Anatoly Marchenko. Okay, I know I talked too much, but I had to stop at this point.
Thank you so much, Ben.
I'm honored to share this panel with Pavel Litvinov, who I've known for about a dozen years, I think, and with Zhanna Nemtsova, who I've known for about 30 minutes. I want to say very briefly just a few things about the demonstration that occurred on August 25th, 1968, and give you a sense of some of the context. I think the context is important because I can imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a way in which Pavel has become famous for this one incredible act, this one day, but there's so much more to his activity in the dissident movement that predated that Sunday in the summer of 1968, and indeed things that he did afterwards. And I would hate to see his role in the history of that movement reduced to this single demonstration, which lasted less than 15 minutes, because the KGB clearly knew about it in advance and was ready to pounce. So the demonstration, I think by anyone's judgment, is an extraordinary event in the history of the Soviet Union, in the history of public protest, as a chapter in the history of the struggle for human rights. And it was a response to a rather extraordinary event, the invasion by the countries of the Warsaw Pact of the Czechoslovakian Soviet Socialist Republic, proving, if there was any doubt, that this was one of the more unusual military alliances in history, in the sense that its only military actions were directed against its own members, Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Almost as shocking as the invasion itself was the demonstration. You know, if you think back to the way people understood or misunderstood the Soviet Union in the 1960s, this kind of thing was not supposed to be possible. This was a totalitarian state all of its citizens were supposed to be either paralyzed by fear or indifferent to politics as someone else's business, or utterly brainwashed by the regime and the ideology of Soviet socialism. So the fact that this actually occurred, the mere fact of the demonstration, was a wake-up call, that the image of the Soviet Union in the West was out of date. It was that of Stalin's Russia and not of post-Stalinist Russia, which in many ways was as different from Stalin's Russia as today's Russia is from Stalin's Russia. So the drama of the transition from the Stalinist to the post-Stalinist order is not to be overstated. So there were 8 participants in this demonstration, although you'll often read that there were 7, and that's because the 8th, Tatyana Bayeva, was misconstrued as a bystander, as an observer rather than a participant. But there were actually 8 people who came that day, 3 women and 5 men. And they came, as Pavel described, to Red Square, which is the symbolically most politically resonant space in the Soviet Union and in Russia today. You couldn't have chosen a more powerful space in Russia to make that statement. They sat down near Lobное место, and again, my friend and the participant can correct me if I'm wrong, but the fact that they sat down is one of the signs that they were aware of some of the new repertoires of protest that had been developing around the world, and in particular in this country. It was described by Anatoly Yakobson, who would have liked to have been there, but his wife decided not to tell him about the time and place, and so he missed it. It was described by him as a sit-down demonstration, a сидящая демонстрация. And this was, of course, borrowed from the repertoire of the civil rights movement in the South, the sit-in, where you came and you sat down until you were removed by the police. Now, in the case of the sit-in demonstrations in the South, they were part of a strategy of civil disobedience, of specifically violating local laws, local Southern laws, which dictated the segregation of the races, and trying to appeal over the heads of local law to federal law. But they were an example of civil disobedience. By contrast, the Soviet dissident movement, including this demonstration, was a radically obedient movement. The whole logic of the movement was to get the Soviet government to obey its own laws. And as part of that campaign of persuasion, the dissidents were very careful to obey Soviet laws. So theirs was a movement of civil obedience and an attempt to extend that mindset, that lawfulness, to the behavior of the state itself. It's difficult to recapture today how controversial the demonstration in Red Square was, even among the liberal, reform-minded intelligentsia of Moscow and other major cities. It's not simply that the 8 protesters refused to conform to the myth propagated by Soviet mass media that there was unanimous support by the Soviet people for this gesture of fraternal assistance to the people of Czechoslovakia. It's not just that they refused to comply with that myth and instead acted on their consciences. It's that they, in many ways, bucked and disobeyed the preferences and advice of their friends, of people who actually were participants in the dissident movement, and whose message to them was essentially this: you are crazy to go out there knowing that you will be immediately arrested and, in the best case scenario, sentenced to 5 to 7 years of either prison or hard labor or exile. Your careers will be ruined. Your families will be torn apart. This is the best case scenario. Your families will be torn apart. And in some ways, worst of all, you will deprive this still tiny dissident movement of some of its most important figures. People like Pavel, who was in many ways Grand Central Station of Samizdat. Everything flowed to him and from him. His apartment on Alexei Tolstoy Street was where everybody met on Tuesday to talk about what was going on, to share information in a society where information was deficit commodity number 1. People like Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who had just launched the Chronicle of Current Events, the underground, but I would still say legal newspaper of the dissident movement. People like Larisa Bogoraz, a force in her own right, who kept alive the memory of her husband, Yuli Daniel, and who was co-author of a critical appeal to world public opinion. Why would you have a demonstration where you essentially served these people up on a platter to the KGB and kissed them goodbye for at least half a decade and maybe forever? So everyone who was thinking in good cost-benefit terms, practical terms, was against this demonstration, even if they opposed the invasion, were ashamed of the invasion, and would have tried to do anything if they thought anything was possible to have Soviet troops withdrawn. An example of such a person was the editor of the leading liberal journal of the time. The journal was Novy Mir, and the editor's name was Alexander Tvardovsky. And in his diary, Tvardovsky wrote, out of this sense of utter shame at what the Soviet Union had done to this reform movement that was trying to give socialism a human face, which means a human face other than that of Joseph Stalin. Here's what he wrote in his diary on August 29th. This is my rough translation. "What shall we do with you, oath of mine?" He was a veteran of the Soviet army. "Where to find the words to relate how in 45 they greeted us in Prague, and how they greet us now in 68. So even though this sense of shame was pervasive among liberal intellectuals, and not only in Moscow, but in other major cities and academic centers, people were dead set against this demonstration. And because everybody knew that if you went out to the square on that day, you were certainly not going to come back, and you might not see your family and friends for many, many years. Because of that incredible weight hanging over every future participant, my understanding from the memoirs and letters and other historical materials that I've been working with is that there was no pressure on anybody to take part. It was considered morally inappropriate to place pressure on anyone to participate. So this was a radically voluntarist demonstration, which helps explain why only 8 people were there. And several of the, again, correct me if I'm wrong, several of those 8 people had never met before. Can you imagine going out to an action like this that is going to change your life forever? You have no idea who's going to show up, and some of the people who are there you've never seen before in your life. And pretty soon you're going to be on trial with them in a courtroom, in a holding prison with them. So it was this very, very strange coming together of these 8 individuals, some of them old friends, some of them complete strangers, one of them with a 5-month-old baby. She's the one who was not arrested on the spot, Natalia Gorbanevskaya. I think if you were to do a calculation of, let's call it the ratio of publicity generated to the number of people and the duration of the protest, this would have to count as the most efficient demonstration in the history of the world, because there were a grand total of 8 people, and they were out there for less than 15 minutes, but this made the front page of every newspaper in the West. And while Pavel said that it wasn't really recognized until some 4 decades later, I'm going to beg to differ with that, because we know from the diary entries that people made then and in the years to follow that reluctance, that opposition, that sense that this was an insane thing to do quickly evaporated. And many Russian intellectuals, Soviet intellectuals, quickly came to regard this as one of the moral high points in the history of their country. There's an interesting conversation to be had about whether 8 people can redeem the consciences of thousands of others. And there are people in Czechoslovakia who said, well, at least we have 7 reasons. They didn't know there was an 8th protester. At least we have 7 reasons not to hate the Russians. And this sense of having taken the sins of the Soviet Union onto their shoulders has become part of the mythology of this demonstration. So you have people writing in their diaries in the 1970s that when the textbooks, and I'm going to quote here a memoir by relative latecomer to the dissident movement, Raisa Orlova, the literary critic, she wrote in her diary, "If humanity does not perish," she wrote this in 1978, "if humanity does not perish, then this event, August 25th, 68, will take pride of place in textbooks on 20th century Russian history." So there was really this sense at the time that this was a truly historic event. These people did not go out there with the illusion that they were going to change Soviet foreign policy. They did not believe for a second that what they were about to do was going to cause the Soviet Union or any of the other Warsaw Pact countries to withdraw troops. There wasn't that kind of cost-benefit analysis, because if there had been, then there would be no sense in having a demonstration. What they went out to do was to demonstrate that even in the darkest political hour, there are always still moral alternatives. There are always choices to be made. And they, simply by placing themselves in that place with those banners at that time, showed what one of the options was, which was to expose the lie of unanimous Soviet public support for the invasion, and to show that it was possible to think outside the ideological framework that the regime was constantly feeding to its populace. It must be said that the populace enjoyed much of that nourishment. Many people in the Soviet Union earnestly supported the invasion, thought that Czechs and the Slovaks were ungrateful bastards for daring to question the Soviet system that had liberated them from Nazi occupation. So I don't want to give the impression that this was a brainwashed population and that these were the only 8 people who were thinking clearly. There were a lot of people in the Soviet Union who supported the invasion and who were, if they learned, which most of them didn't, but if they learned about the demonstration, were incensed that people had the temerity to criticize the Soviet regime for standing up for socialism and for enforcing socialism against these terrible revisionists in Prague. Well, humanity did not perish, but the official history textbooks in today's Russia do not mention this demonstration. They pass over it in silence, and I don't think anybody, certainly in this room, is going to be surprised by that fact, given what we know about Vladimir Putin's visceral aversion to public demonstrations that are critical of official policy. And again, I just want to say that that aversion to public demonstrations is something that's widely shared by the Russian population today. They don't like demonstrations. They don't like symptoms of political disagreement and disorder. So it takes a special kind of character to go out and even peacefully express disagreement with the state. When the opposition politician Boris Nemtsov called in 2015 for a public demonstration against the Russian invasion of another neighboring country whose government was pivoting away from Moscow towards Europe, in this case, of course, it was Ukraine, he was assassinated. And he was assassinated just a stone's throw from where that immortal demonstration occurred in August of '68. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, so much, Zhanna.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I haven't prepared any special introductory note, so I will comment on what has already been said. So I think that the best way is to explain why I'm here today. My father is the leader of the opposition, but actually he started as a dissident. He was, as Mr. Litvinov, a physicist, and he started his professional career as a physicist in Nizhny Novgorod. It was called then Gorky. It was a closed city because there were a lot of military plants there. He became a dissident by chance, and it happened because of the initiative of their local government in Nizhny Novgorod to build a nuclear plant after the disaster that happened in Chernobyl. And my grandma, she's still alive, she's 90 years old. She was a doctor, a medical doctor, and she was strongly against the construction of this nuclear plant. And she asked my father to support her in this attempt to stop the construction, because he was a physicist and he had really serious arguments against the construction of this plant. And that, at this point, his political career started. And the turning point was then he went to Moscow to interview Andrei Sakharov, who was in exile in Nizhny Novgorod before, who had been in exile in Nizhny Novgorod before. So he went to Moscow. It was the first and the last time when he worked as a journalist. And he interviewed, actually, Andrei Sakharov on the construction of the plant. And they also talked about the situation with human rights. But the newspaper, which was called Leninskaya Smena, I don't know what's the translation into English. So they published only the part about the construction of the plant. And they omitted this part about the human rights situation in the Soviet Union. So, and the construction was stopped. But my father became a politician because he was very known in Nizhny Novgorod, and he joined the team of Yeltsin, and his political career started at the age of 32 or 32. He became the governor of the Nizhny Novgorod region. And then in the mid-90s, he joined the government, and then he became the leader of the opposition. But I want to sound more optimistic than Mr. Litvinov and Mr. Nathans. And I think that the dissident movement in Russia has changed significantly and to the better. First of all, it has grown dramatically. It's not about 8 people right now. The demonstration against the Russia-fueled military operation in Ukraine brought together thousands of people, because my father organized this protest back in 2014. That's one thing. And all the protests which you witness right now in Russia, which you have witnessed, even those which are not permitted by the government, they're attended by thousands of people, not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but across Russia. And second important thing that has happened lately in Russia is that the opposition, the dissident movement, if I might call it, or the movement of dissenters, has changed its face. It was previously dominated by the older generation. Now it is dominated by people younger than me, much younger than me. These are freshmen or schoolboys, and it's thanks to Navalny that he brought these people in. And I talked to some very, very young human rights activists, as I might call it. So it's not a hopeless cause. We have made a tremendous progress, probably not seen here from Washington. And I think that it's a good sign that new people are joining this movement. So I think that I can speak a lot, but I think that's what I wanted to say as my introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Zhanna. So I want to ask a couple of questions while our audience considers its questions. We're going to move to Q&A. I actually want to ask Pavel a question that I think that probably people ask you a lot of times, but I think that it's something that for us who seek to learn lessons from acts of courage such as yours, what was the source of your courage? Because it's almost, Ben and I were talking about it before the event. I think to us today, knowing everything that you stood up against, it almost seems incomprehensible that 8 of you would walk out and stand there. What was the source of that?
It's a very good question, and I'm asked a lot, and I don't know the answer, but I will try. What can I say? I grew up, in the Soviet Union with all Soviet propaganda of communism and Marxism and Leninism, all those things, which today, obviously, totalitarian regime, which breaks people, puts them in prison, and start to build them as a certain, like Stalin would say, little bolts who will make the country. But in fact, the communism came historically from kind of humanistic, I would say, tradition, from the same tradition from which came social democracy. And they couldn't hide it completely. Lenin originally was social democrat, and he was united with so-called Menshevik party, which split one in more democratic, another in more totalitarian way. So it means that we were taught in school some ideas of sympathy to those people who suffer, who are persecuted, and our heroes was official heroes were workers who in Tsarist Russia made a movement against Tsarism and early capitalism and landowners and so on and so on. So it was one of the sources that we learned that. Also, we were taught in the greatest contribution of Russian, which Russia gave to the world, is Russian literature of 19th century. And Russian literature from Pushkin to Tolstoy, with many names in between, had one thing very important, in my opinion, in common, that it had a sympathy to the small man against big state. Like Pushkin hero Yevgeny, who was against Peter the Great monument, which in his mad dream was running and harassing this poor Yevgeny through streets of St. Petersburg. Gogol's pure bureaucrat, small official who was robbed of his dream overcoat, which he managed to buy once. And all these things were very important for us, and of course the poetry of Pushkin and so on. So I personally, and I think many people in my generation, perhaps earlier and later, we were very deep into this moral authority. That's what supported us. And when the Soviet Union sent troops to Czechoslovakia, we felt, as Ben already mentioned absolutely correctly, that it's from our names they sent these troops. And we want to say, no, it's from their names, but not ours. Don't count me in. I'm out of this thing. That was very strong feeling, and that was enough. And when I was on my way to Red Square, I felt very good. I felt that I'm doing something which my inners demand from me. So I was almost flying like Peter Pan. I'm not sure it's a right comparison, but I felt very good. So there was no problem. I knew that I will go to prison and labor camp. I was ready to that. I was preparing to that. I was reading about Martin Luther King and especially Gandhi, and their ideas were, I was very full of those ideas. So that's probably the best I could answer your question.
Thank you so much. Ben, I want to ask you, it's almost a question maybe of terminology. We talk about that generation of dissidents as dissidents. I don't hear that term used after the fall of the Soviet Union. Can you explain that?
The first thing I should say is that the dissidents hated being called the dissidents. They did not. They did not like that term. It was a foreign word.
They got used to it eventually.
It's a foreign word. It means in Latin those who sit apart. And they didn't see themselves as sitting apart. It was everybody else who was sitting apart. They were trying to be politically engaged. And also it's a foreign word, and the KGB loved to use that foreign word to tag them because the whole theory was that they were agents of foreign influence. And by giving them a name that itself was foreign, that only reinforced that interpretation of what they were up to. They preferred to call themselves rights defenders, правозащитники, or people who think differently, other thinkers. It's a very difficult word to pronounce in Russian, but I'll...
Инакомыслящие.
Inakомыслящие, yeah. Not dissidents. Why is this term not used today? I suspect Zhanna is in a better position to answer this, but my sense is that there are two reasons. One is, for all of its moral high points, I would not say the dissident movement succeeded in creating a society ruled by law in which basic civil and human rights were respected. So there is a tremendous moral example to appeal to, but not a history of political success. The other reason is that regardless of what you read in the headlines or your image of Russia today is still very different from the Soviet Union. There is much more freedom of expression. The internet is still wide open. There's still at least one radio station that is wide open to differing opinions, and much of the print media is still, I would say, a more or less free press operating under difficult conditions. So we really have to keep in mind that Putin's Russia is not Soviet Union redux. It's really a different context, and therefore I think the nature of opposition activity is very different in that context.
Yeah. And Zhanna, I want to ask you also actually a couple of questions. I'm curious if your father thought of himself as a dissident, if he drew parallels. You say that he knew Andrei Sakharov, and then also whether what is you said that you're optimistic about the young generation of protesters today. I think we hear, there is sort of the perception of, Putin's generation, that young people today are more conformist in Russia. They just want to climb the career ladder, work for the government. What is your sense of this generation?
Regarding the term dissident, it's not used in Russia, of course, right now, but I know that it is used widely in Western media to describe Russian protesters or dissenters. So in Russia, we use the term dissenters to describe those people who take part in protests. And also, there is another big difference with the Soviet Union, because in the Soviet Union, as I understand, there were no political leaders of protests. Now there are political leaders, and that's why we call, for example, Navalnysty. It's those people who support Navalny. They are Navalnysty. We call Khodorkovtsy those who are supporters of Khodorkovsky, and Sobchakovtsy are those who are supporters. So it's much more personalized, and people can choose between different, as it is said in Russian, non-systemic opposition forces. So, yeah. But dissenters...
No, if you finish.
Нет, я не ответила на второй вопрос. I didn't answer the second question.
Sorry. I want to add something.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's very important that when we were discussing in the first year, 67, 68, 69, especially 68, who we are and what are we doing, I once formulated the principle, which I think confirm what Zhanna is saying, that our movement was not a political movement, because political movement always implies some possibility of breakthrough and victory. We didn't expect that at all. But at some point I formulated that it's a movement for possibility in the future to have a political movement. So it was pre-political movement. And that's why it is natural that now Navalny probably has 1 million supporters. And and Boris Nemtsov was the most popular and bright figure. I met him only once, but I could see the presence of real political leader. Most of us with in dissident movement didn't have even such type of personality. People who wanted to do and achieve something, including personal achievement, they would join something else. But politicians don't join dissidents. They could use dissidents for their support, but they need something bigger, and that's what makes difference.
I agree. So the second question, so first of all, you cannot generalize. You cannot say that our generation, or those people who are dubbed as the generation of Putin, is hopeless or is our hope. It's very different. So it depends on, as always, on the level of education. On their background, there are people. It's not a big, of course, in terms of the Russian opposition, this movement created by Navalny is big, but in terms of our country, it's small. In terms of the whole generation, it's only a small part of the whole generation, because it's always a minority. Activists are not a majority. If you have a majority of activists, something is awful in your country, like in Czechoslovakia. So it happens rarely when the majority of people joins any activist movements. But still, it is quite an active minority. So I cannot say. I'm quite pessimistic about the possibility for them to change something. And I see that some of them decide to flee Russia because they are quite educated people. They are sometimes expelled from our Russian universities and they have to find something abroad. But they all, at this point, when they are 20 years old, not like me, 34 years old. So at this point, they are full of hope so that they can come to Russia and they can change something. We don't know, but it's important to stress, yes, that Russia is a different country from the Soviet Union, and we now have much more active people, and they can use internet, they can have a variety of sources of information. But whether it can lead to political change, I don't know, and nobody knows.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's see. We have, all right, so please, let's take some questions. Please wait for the microphone. Introduce yourself and just ask a very brief question. No statements, please.
No, I'm just stating my name because of this background, because we were affected by communism by both Russia, China, and everybody, okay? I survived a 1970 massacre, 2 of them. There will be futures like this on our side of communism, free, coordinated with the Wilson Center, because I'm not qualified to speak about it. I am here to learn. But future-wise, in the Philippines, the communism is Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Fidel Castro, and my son had a sense to fall in love with somebody whose father was part of the underground movement that overthrew communism in Poland. So,
Thank you.
coordination and free.
Thank you for that. Okay.
Tom Timberg, consultant. I wondered if you would comment a bit on a couple of the big changes in environment. The biggest one is, as distinguished from samizdat, you now have the internet. And as distinguished from Stalinist Russia, tremendous numbers of young, older people have traveled abroad, know a bit about what the rest of the world is like. And the question is, how much of a change does that make? I guess the one thing that always struck me is this might affect the kind of thing you're talking about, which is continuity. I mean, the the early intellectuals like Pushkin and Gogol, they created continuity through Russian culture, despite the Okhrana. Some other groups did. On the other hand, Memorial, which you thought might have created some continuity, independently of the government suppression, younger generation never took off. It remained essentially a how do I say a veterans organization for people who had suffered in the Gulag. Useful thing, but so do these two factors affect things, and do they affect the possibility of continuity between, as you say, the dissenters, etc., and the next generation, or don't they?
Okay. First of all, it's not quite correct. Memorial definitely started as a group which tried to create, remind people, to create memory of people who, millions of those who died in Stalinist labor camp, and write the real, true history of what was the Soviet Union. Indeed is, and still they continue their work in spite of being harassed and persecuted and declared foreign agents and so on, but it still exists. But in the same time, in the same memorial, there are younger people, and in the same room, in the same building with memorial, there is a room where it's hidden by some strange abbreviation called OVD Info. OVD means отделение внутренних дел, Office of Internal Affairs, and info is information. People there created many things, including website and telephone bank, where 24 hours a day, any time of the year, from any place in Russia, people can call and say that we were arrested for picketing the building, we were arrested for this and that. And this, over the info, in the best Western tradition, have telephone numbers and email addresses of several thousand lawyers who are ready to volunteer, and they immediately are going to defend. And I saw in no cases when this over the info immediately forced police to stop and slow down. So these people are not all young, but basically belong to younger generation. And I met some of these lawyers who are making money by being lawyers and doing normal lawyerly thing. But at the same time, they volunteer their time and threat and reputation for helping. It's just one example. And when you see some small demonstration of several thousand, you suddenly see very young people, as young as 9, you could see pulled by police. I mentioned when I came to Moscow to commemorate 50 years of our demonstration, I came to Red Square. They, of course, didn't let us to come close to Lobное место. They put a gate, and inside of Red Square they made a parade of military orchestras throughout the world. So that's how they respected our demonstration. And when I came, I started to speak, and there were about 50 microphones right near that in Red Square to me, explaining the things which I was talking today. And as I mentioned, mine and Natalia Gorbanevska's granddaughter came with the slogan "Freedom to Nemtsov." She was, while I was speaking, 2 policemen took slogan from her and took her to police. I even didn't notice, and my sister, who were next to me, said, "Look what's going on." And I saw 2 policemen pulling politely this young, smallish woman toward police station, and my American wife, who knows about 10 words in Russian, was moving on the street. It's all, fortunately, on camera trying to see where they take the girl. So it was, I mean, at that time I was worried, but it sounds really funny. And those 3 people who were arrested, actually, after 3 hours in police, they were released. And on the 19th, I think, they're supposed to come to court. Most likely they will be fined, significant fine, but not insurmountable, and people will raise money for them. That's also well organized, and nobody does anything. So I can give you many examples, but it definitely, there is, as Zhanna said, there is a movement, was inspired, I don't know, by her father and by us, or both of them. So to say that it's nothing today and the only old generation, it's not true.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment?
Yes, I would. We haven't mentioned today a very important thing. So yes, we have free internet. You asked the question, if I got you right, that we have this relatively big movement, but no change. I can answer why. The problem is that for the majority of people, the main source of information is not YouTube. It's Russian television. And Russian television is controlled. We don't have any television channels independent of the Russian state. So they are all controlled, and that's their main source of information. On YouTube, on the internet, only interested citizens are looking for information. They don't know anything about, I don't know, Medusa or some over the info, Media Zone, etc., all this, or TV Rain. And as long as the main source of information is controlled by the state, no change can occur, because people just don't know. The only thing that motivates people to get more information is what the government has recently done by they took a decision to increase the retirement age. And that's what worries lots of people. They are not worried about democratic values. They know nothing about this, and they see no connection between freedoms and social welfare. But when the government tries to get in their pockets, they are worried. They try to find information on the internet. And what's important, I read today that television was the most credible source of information for many people. And now this rate of credibility has soared. And the reason is the increase of the retirement age. Yes, that's the only reason. And also the rate of approval of Mr. Putin, it stood around 80%. It fell 20 percentage points. It's now only 60%. And the reason is not the curbs put on the democratic institutions, etc., but money.
Well, economic interests, right? One could say.
But
okay.
Money.
Right. Okay, please, right there. I think Kathy, then Will.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pavel, and everyone, for this fascinating discussion. I wanted to focus specifically on public demonstrations and to mention several types, which I think may not have been mentioned. And that is, in the 1960s, I believe the Crimean Tatars held very small, but significant demonstrations on the Red Square, and also organized petition drives for them to be allowed to return to their homeland. Which got tens of thousands of signatures,
Hundreds of thousands, yeah.
Hundreds of thousands. Sorry, and also as far as demonstrations are concerned, all over Russia. In addition, of course, to the pension demonstrations, I think a significant cause is environmental issues of various kinds. Thank you. I'd love a response.
You want to respond to that, or
I don't know, but Ben, you
Ben?
say something.
I think what's really interesting about your point is that some things get noticed and some things get left in the shadows. And it's true now, and it was also true in the 1960s. And what got noticed in the 1960s was when metropolitan intellectuals, people in Moscow and Leningrad, demonstrated with using the language of rights, of civil rights and human rights. That resonated among Western journalists and Western publics in a way that the demand for a return to the Crimean homeland did not, even though the numbers were incomparably larger when it came to the Crimean movement. And even the protests against environmental degradation, which often went hand in hand with movements to preserve historical buildings from destruction, those also, despite very significant numbers, did not get the kind of coverage that they probably deserved. And I've been wondering, why is that? What was the sort of perceptual prism that caused some things to qualify as front page news and others to either get lost entirely or relegated to the back pages at best of major newspapers? And, I think part of the answer is inescapably the Cold War. There was a certain set of interests and expectations about what was newsworthy behind the Iron Curtain. And people protesting for basic civil and political liberties was, the hottest topic you could find, because it wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be impossible under a totalitarian system. And the list of people who got less attention is very long. I mean, there were large movements of evangelical Christians and Baptists in the Soviet Union who created underground newspapers before the Chronicle of Current Events came out. And yet they were almost invisible to most observers in the West. So, part of the work that historians are trying to do is to recapture the landscape as it was, not just as it appeared to be to the major media outlets at the time, in real time.
And even not only Crimean Tatars, but there was Ukrainian movement, there was Georgian and Armenian movement, parallel to dissident, but independent, and it was not covered as much. It was covered as much as it intersected with the main values of dissident movement. So it's just how it works, because the national movements, people say, oh, we have a lot of that in the world. We in America kind of sick and tired from any national issues. So I think it was just natural, but Crimean Tatars became, thanks to several of leaders of dissident movement, became very close friend of ours, and their continual leader, Mustafa Jamilov, who is now not permitted to live in Crimea, he lives in Kiev, was intersected with us. Pyotr Grigorenko, Russian general who was member of our movement, and several other people, really made a very deep support among Crimean Tatars. And I personally tried to speak up about, when I immigrated, about Crimean Tatars, and wrote to United Nations, and we made a press conference in NYU at some moment supporting Crimean Tatars. And the interest was very, not cold, but pretty lukewarm, I would say. But that's American question, not Russian.
Thank you. I think Will had a question. Okay, and then you.
Two questions, one for Pavel, one for Ben. For Pavel, could you maybe explain why you think the authorities let this demonstration take place, since you were being followed and they were waiting for you and expecting you? What was the rationale that they thought that they would pursue by allowing your demonstration to take place? And for Ben, I just want to follow up on your interesting comment about civil obedience and the idea that the state would obey their own laws. And I know you've mentioned in other articles about Mr. Volpin that I think they told him he was crazy if they thought that the Soviet Union would obey their laws. But from your perspective, what had changed post-Stalin? Was there a different understanding of law or approach to law that would allow a different outcome?
Okay, I will try to answer. So what you're trying to say, could you repeat the first part?
Why did
Why they need? Well, that's a complicated question. First of all, it's not clear they allowed it. They knew that we were planning something, but we didn't talk on the phone. We met each other. They didn't know when. They didn't know where. They were following, and then apparently there was a plan. If they do it, we have to beat them up and arrest. And we will get rid of them, at least their most active leaders at the time, and that's probably easier. They were ready to arrest me for several other reasons. One of the simple reasons to arrest me was that I was social parasite by Soviet law. I didn't work because I was kicked out from my teaching position as assistant professor of physics, but
you were very busy.
Yeah,
you were extremely busy.
That's true, absolutely. So they thought that they could use this information this demonstration as a pretext. So it's hard to say why they exactly permitted that, but they had to grab us all and arrest in advance without us doing something, and they were not ready to do that. They had something ready for me, something ready for Larissa Bagaraz, but for some others, they were not prepared, but who knows, of course.
Who knows are the archivists of the KGB in Moscow, and if they would just open the archives and let us in, we could probably come up with a good answer to your question, but it's very difficult to say. So you asked about this philosophy of sort of leveraging Soviet law against the state. So I think of this as an attempt to practice a form of containment, not the George Kennan kind of containment from outside, but containment from within, by using legal structures to control the behavior of the state. The reason why I think that approach became at least plausible, although you're absolutely right, many people thought it was not just impractical, but sort of childishly naive to think that the Soviet state would obey its own laws. I think the reason why certainly Volpin thought it was plausible, this mathematician who came up with this strategy, is that the unmasking of Stalin by Khrushchev in 1956 in the secret speech created a whole narrative of what had gone wrong and what was the solution to what had gone wrong in the Soviet Union. This unforeseen deviation from what was supposed to be the glorious narrative of socialism in Russia. And what had gone wrong was the cult of personality, and the solution to that deviation was to rebuild respect for socialist legality. And that became the mantra that everyone repeated. It was all about restoring socialist legality. You know, never mind that the architect of the show trials and some of the most egregious executions of completely innocent Soviet citizens was Andrei Vyshinsky, who was the author of the main books about Soviet legality, socialist legality. Doesn't matter. The point is that the regime, if only to protect itself, the leadership, if only to save their own skins against another round of purges and bloodletting, saw law as the solution. So there was reason to think that there was enough of an investment in law as a mechanism of social control that this strategy might succeed. Everyone understood that the application of the law was highly selective, that the courts were completely subject to political pressure in the form of telephone calls to judges in advance of trials, dictating, the sentence will be such and such. Nonetheless, it seemed that there was some leverage to be had through the law. And for many intellectuals, law offered a system of textual commandments and prohibitions that was coherent and discrete and, for the most part, public and therefore subject to interpretation and debate. And finally, what other alternative was there short of armed uprising, which nobody wanted? Nobody wanted a revolution of any kind. They'd lived through that and had enough. And this was a way of at least promoting peaceful change in a structured internalist manner.
The attempt to build some kind of dialogue with authorities, and we insisted. Some people criticized us for that approach. What dialogue? This is, I remember Alexander Volpin, who was the founder of this direction, was at my birthday. There was a very interesting, in 1967, dialogue. Some men who already spent 5 years in labor camp under Stalin and hated the Soviet regime and communism with the deepest hate, and very passionate. And he said to Volpin, why are you talking about defending Soviet constitution? And Volpin organized demonstration in defense of Sinyavsky and Daniel, with one of the slogan was, respect your constitution. And this man said, it's a Stalin's constitution, it's communist constitution, nothing we can do about that, because the Soviet Union is a gang of criminals, and you're talking about constitution with them. And Volpin, one has to see Volpin, it was quite a figure, with slow but very precise thing, with movement of his finger. I mean, I cannot describe how good he was. And he said approximately following: yes, you're right. There is a Soviet gang and there is a Soviet power. And the Soviet power is based legally on a certain set of laws. And we support this Soviet power because it supports these laws. And there is a Soviet gang, and that gang violates these laws. So we support Soviet power against Soviet gang. That's the idea of our movement. I cannot say better than he did.
Well, I think I promised a question to another person, but we've just run out of time. Please feel free to come up and talk to our speakers, ask your questions directly. Let's thank our speakers for this fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next events. Thank you for coming.